Every now and then I hear things that it's like it helps me to understand more clearly something that I kind of understood vaguely. I don't know if this makes sense, but you hear people use quotes. They said that Ford used to say that whether you think you can or whether you think you can't, you're right. And I kind of get the general sense of that, like whatever you believe to be true, you can pursue with that sort of approach. And it turns out that whether you thought you could or whether you thought you couldn't, turns out to be true. Sort of the Dumbo with the feather sort of an idea. But a couple months ago, and I should have tried to find who this was. I couldn't find a name. It's not my work. It's someone else's, and I would give them credit, but I can't think of their name. But I heard someone describing our conscious mind like a whiteboard. And I don't mean subconscious, where something's going on sort of behind the scenes. I mean, what you're actively thinking about is like a whiteboard. And that's why when you're counting, if you're like counting cows going through a gate, we tell everybody when you're counting cows, if you're ever counting cows with somebody, they'll tell you count in your head, don't count out loud. And the reason for that is if you're counting and then pretty soon someone else starts counting and you can hear their numbers, your whiteboard gets jumbled, because now it's not only the information you're putting up there on your mind's eye, now it's someone else putting their information and it gets confusing. So I want to look a little bit more at the whiteboard, and I think what we'll find is if we can understand how our conscious mind chooses what to focus on, then we'll better understand things that we found in the Bible that sort of speak to that same idea. It's almost like that the more we learn, the more sense the Bible makes, not the opposite. How to intentionally protect your whiteboard. And we're also wrapping up a series on life plus, not just existing. I think anybody that's been alive for very long understands what this concept means, that you're just living until you die. You're just trying to survive. You're trying to get through the day. You go to sleep at night, and the next day you start all over again. It doesn't feel intentional. It doesn't feel like you've got a purpose or a passion. There's no necessary clarity on your vision. It is so easy to get so distracted by what's right in front of you and focus on your whiteboard because you're not protecting what's up there that you lose track. Business people might say it this way, that you're working in your business instead of working on your business. You're working in your life so hard in your life that you're losing focus on how to work on your life. The whole series has been based around this story, and I want to go back to it again. Matthew 17, verse 1, it says, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. Again, life plus climbing mountains. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Now, if you've been keeping up with this series, you'll understand those two figures now, and you're like, okay, got it. Top of a mountain, Jesus experience. Wait a minute. The stories are starting to add a little bit more depth. Talking with Jesus. And I'm going to tell you what I think they were talking about. I think I can tell you what they were discussing, but we're going to get to that. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love, and with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down on the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. So much to take in. So much to take in. The last few weeks, we've looked at Elijah and his mountaintop experience and the grace that God demonstrated through Elijah's story at the top of the mountain, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb. And that exact same mountain, God demonstrates this expression of law and of justice with Moses. And so it's the perfect culmination. Elijah's experience and Moses' experience at the top of Mount Horeb, same mountain, with mercy and justice. And now we see him fully becoming alive as God in front of them, and he's got those two back with him again. When I was a kid, we spent a majority of our life, my dad was a missionary, and we traveled a lot. And if we weren't at rodeos or racetracks, we were at churches. I know that's a weird trifecta of locations. 2 of those are usually mutually exclusive from the other, but we spent a lot of time in the back seat of a truck, and I had 2 brothers. So we fought a lot. I always had to have a string, even if it was a hay string, didn't matter. If I had a string, I could be roping my foot. But we used to, as a family, and this is probably universal, this is probably the one thing that my childhood had in common with everyone else's, is we used to play a game called I Spy. Now, the game itself isn't unique, but let me tell you why I'm referencing it. What I Spy was determining was where some person in the car, where one player in this game, where that person had chosen to place his focus. And the reason this game can be difficult is because we've got a million potential things to focus on. In any given moment, in any given vehicle, you've got a million things to choose from. So to narrow it down to one person's scope of focus can be sometimes easy, sometimes difficult. When you're hunting, Jet, I wasn't really much of a hunter, and then my son Jet, he comes along and he just loves it. He's loved it all along. And when you hunt, you use a scope. And I'm sure most of you guys know this, but for those of you who may not know, a scope is like a magnifying lens that you place on top of a gun. And when you look through it, it does two things. It magnifies or makes larger the thing that you're wanting to focus on, but it also eliminates the distractions that are unimportant. It eliminates what's unimportant to the target task, which is hunting or trying to get a better view at what you're trying to shoot. But you get to aim, you get to choose where you aim that scope. It's a frustrating moment when what you're wanting to look at doesn't line up. You're trying to shoot at something, and what you're trying to focus on, you can't get in the scope. You go, man, Jordan, this seems embarrassingly simple. Stick with me. I've been listening to a man named John Vervaeke, and I cannot recommend his stuff enough. He is such a fascinating figure, but one of his main areas of study is how to describe what meaning means. What does it mean to mean something? His argument is that as a people, we're in this crisis of meaning. We're in this information overload. We've got a million things we could focus on, and we're losing our ability to decide what's important and what's not. And if we're not careful, having too many things to potentially focus on distracts us from focusing on things that matter or that are important. Some of the questions that I think could be so simple, but that are actually very complicated are, how do we decide what information is relevant? This gets much more complicated. Stick with me. How do we know what to decide is important? How do we know what to focus on? How do we know what matters? How do we know what's useless? What has value? What's useless? And basically, I feel like I'm getting heady. I'm in my own head trying to decide how to make this more interesting, but we'll get there. I hope. But that as people, we don't necessarily respond to behaviors. I think in religious settings, we've tried to really push behaviors. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to do that. And he said people don't typically respond to behaviors. We as people, we respond the most deeply to meanings. His example was, if you're in a house and you see flames, you run. If you're in a house and someone yells fire, you run. If you're in a house and you smell smoke, you get out of the house. And his point is, even though the sensories are coming at us from different levels, there's a lot of different ways to describe the problem. The real meaning is that there's a fire and there's a danger, and the way that we escape the danger, the meaning of this concept is that we escape the danger by getting out of the house. So really, to drill down into what is the meaning behind why we're doing what we're doing, how do we determine what has importance and what doesn't matter? And it turns out, I think this is so fascinating, and I'm probably nerding out a little bit, but stick with me. For years, we thought that artificial intelligence was going to be impossible because there's no way that artificial intelligence could solve deep, complicated problems. The logic and the reason that was required to solve these deep logical issues and problems that AI could never figure it out, but we were wrong. They can. Computers can figure out very deeply intricate problems and scenarios, and they can come up with solutions. And so then all of a sudden there's this swing to, oh man, AI is going to take over the world. But what we've discovered, actually, almost maybe accidentally or maybe an unintended consequence of going this far down the technology road, is that we talk about what is important and what matters as a casual thing. But what we realize is that's the hurdle between useful robots, and people. The reason that AI has had such a problem is because when you look at the world, there's too many things you could potentially take in, and it is what makes us human. Stick with me. This is where it gets interesting. It's what makes us human to intuit or to consciously understand what's important and what has value and what can be ignored. If we're going to paint a picture of someone, we could start with the very fibers in the carpet. But as people, we know, well, that's not important to the picture. We instinctively know, okay, that's not a real important detail. In fact, you can kind of blur that out because nobody's going to be looking at the carpet. We know it's there, but we don't have to really focus on it. But what we're trying to draw out of this scenario and put into a painting would be this person's nature or their appearance, or try to get their character. There are things in these pictures that matter, but how do we know which is which? How do we know what matters and what's unimportant? And that is quite probably what makes us people, is this intuition or the ability to take all of the information and decide what's important and what's not. Bored out of your head yet? How do we ignore the inflation of the unimportant? the inflation of how do we as people go through life and effectively accomplish anything if we don't know how to suppress unimportant things without also elevating or hyper-focusing on things that actually do matter? You with me? Because if you're driving down the road, I think I wish I would have looked up this there's a medical condition where you will focus on every specific little details. Like you lose the ability to distinguish between what's important and what's not important. Imagine how dangerous this is if you're driving down the road and you get lost studying the buttons on the radio and you're not focusing on what's important. There's actually death as a result of not focusing on what matters. We know this with cell phones. If you're looking at your cell phone, you're distracted. You are giving your attention or your focus to something less important than the task at hand. And so when the Bible talks about the wages of sin is death, we hear that as rule. We hear that as we're going to compel behavior. We hear that as you better do this or else. And I think what the Bible is trying to describe is the need to determine what is important and what's unimportant, to put our focus on things that matter and not be distracted by things that don't matter, to not become so unaligned with what's important that we end up in death or a car accident because we've allowed our focus to shift to something that doesn't matter. I don't even care at this point if I sound nerdy. I think this is so fascinating because all of this is found during the Mount of Transfiguration. Jordan Peterson and John Vervecke and a guy named Jonathan Prajow had a podcast and a conversation about this, and the three of them tend to agree on this one thing, is that the only way as people that we're able to start to formalize what's important or what's not. The only way that we can really prioritize the important without inflating the unimportant is if we grasp, ready for this? We go back to simple, simple, complex, simple. We're going back to simple. Ready? It's if we grasp the story that's being told. That if we can grasp the story that's being told, we instantly categorize what's important and what's not important. See, when Jesus talks about taking the disciples up on the top of Mount Transfiguration and he's going to become this godlike appearance in Moses and Elijah, he's giving us the important details, and we don't get lost on what color were the rocks, because we're starting to understand there's a story being told, and the color of the rocks don't contribute to the value or the meaning of the story. That's what makes us human, is our ability to parse out meaning and importance from stories. We read stories to our babies. We read stories to our children. We've known this instinctively all along, but the way that we've known that is because we operate according to a human set of values that is always looking for what's important and what's not. Another example, and this was given by Jordan Peterson also, he said, when you look at an apple, your brain instantly starts to categorize this apple. Is this apple good? And you go, yes, this apple is good. But then he goes, but wait a minute. How do we know what good means? Does it mean good for your purpose or for your story? Or does it mean good for fertilizer? You see, if we're not careful, we can lose all scope of importance. But we generally take things and put it in order according to, does this reach my intended purpose for it? As simplistic as that is, we view the world as, does this serve my wishes for it? Does this promote my narrative or my story or my choice? And then we categorize things as good or as bad. It's why we're able to look at people as bad, is because we've got a story or a narrative or a place that we want to go in our lives. And sometimes people fit with that, sometimes they don't, because we have a tendency as people to place the highest level of importance on our own story. Whew. I can feel people tuning out. Formation of story is how we perceive the world. So maybe that means the world is stories. I want to give you 4 examples of what I mean when I say you can't look too close. You can't look too close at money. People spend their time and their effort. They categorize money as the highest importance. People can do this all the time. They can categorize money as the highest importance in the same way that we look at an apple and go, yeah, that fits my narrative. That fits what I want that apple to be good for. We can look at money and go, yes, money is good because it fits what I want in my life. But the problem is when you start breaking down what money can or can't do, you give it all back in the end. Maybe it serves another purpose, but on its way, it can't serve the real big problems. It doesn't say that money makes people happy. It doesn't say that more money makes the impossible health issues go away. It doesn't say that if your child is dying in a hospital that money can make that better. It doesn't say that you can establish value for yourself at an eternal level. The point is you can't look too close at money. So the focus can go to money, but it can't go too close to money. You can't look too close at it or it falls apart. Same with power. Power seems like a great thing. Maybe short-term power is this wonderful thing, but the problem with power is you look too closely at it and what you realize is all it's going to do is promote your story. And as people, we generally tend to understand that our story just isn't that great. Fame, boy, ask a famous person how awesome it is to be famous, and they're going to tell you, at first there are some cool things, and then it's just a prison. Do you see what I'm saying? We can choose to focus on something, but only from a blurry standpoint. We can only look at it so close because if we look too close into it, it falls through to the other side. It's paper thin. Same with the pursuit of pleasure. You look up stories of like King Henry and all the things that would go on in his life, and he was on this constant pursuit of pleasure, and he could never get it. Why? Because you can't look too closely at it, because when you look too closely at the fibers of the DNA of these things, they fall apart. So we constantly live our lives with a half-cocked, blurry, half-out-of-focus view of our narrative and how it can be used to benefit what we want to accomplish. And what we realize is actually, you go to what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, is that all of a sudden, if you're not careful, life becomes pointless. Everything becomes pointless and useless and of no value. Seems like a nihilistic sermon, I know. You can only pursue things like money or power or fame or pleasure if there's a limit to how closely you inspect them. Maybe your biggest problem is that you're tired of your job and you think that money would solve that, and maybe it would, but it's going to leave you with another problem. They say the reason that most of the people that lost all of their fortunes when they won the lottery, almost all of them quit their job the next day because they thought their job was constricting them, and what they found out was actually it was the structure that was keeping them healthy. Something to get up for every single day. You see what I'm saying? You look too closely at things and they begin to fall apart. Life plus, or life more abundantly, probably hinges more on what we focus on than any other aspect of life. When we talk about life more abundantly, life more enriched, I think it's so easy when you're so close to the poverty ditch to overcorrect and think that wealth would fix it. But what we find is there's a ditch on both sides of the road. The balance is in not going too far either direction, which means there's got to be something bigger than either side that holds our focus. John 14:6 says this. First of all, at the bottom of the mountain, there's too many things to hold your attention. There's just too many things, like your job, your spouse, your career, your sports, the weather. There's 1,000 things that you can place your focus on. And keep in mind, it's like a scope. It's like a hunting scope, that when you give it your focus, you're also eliminating all of the other possibilities, all of the other things that matter and that are important. John 14:6 says this, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You've heard this. We know this. You could probably quote it out loud as I'm reading it. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. There are so many ways to misinterpret what it's saying, but according to your focus, like what John Vervecchi says, is that the meaning, not what you're looking at, but the meaning behind it. Not just smelling the smoke and reacting, not just doing something because it's a rule, but the meaning behind that. The meaning, the thing that holds that verse is Jesus is saying, it's not until I am the ultimate good. It's not until you place me at the center of your focus and that I become the ultimate good that you're drawn into a life. Everything else is sin and misalignment and death. Until every other thing is eliminated as the ultimate good. You hear what I'm saying? Until every other outlet is eliminated as the ultimate good. Money cannot be the ultimate good, and you still pursue Jesus. You can't pursue power as the ultimate good and also pursue a life committed to God. A life committed to God is almost a surrender of your power. A life committed to God is almost a surrendering of your fame or the pursuit of pleasure. You see what I mean? All these traps that we get caught in. Jesus says, it's impossible to find me until I'm at the center of the scope, until your focus aligns to me and you can't look too closely at him. There, he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. If you were a prisoner and you were guilty of what you'd been accused of, it would be so easy to look at mercy as the ultimate good. Yes, I'm guilty. However, mercy would save my life. And so what is the ultimate good? The ultimate good is mercy. Well, the problem with ultimate mercy is that it eliminates justice. It means that everybody gets let off the hook. If mercy is the ultimate achievement of mankind, then what that means is there is no such thing as right and wrong. And I know that's hard because we don't want to surrender right and wrong, but we also don't want to surrender mercy. When you look at Elijah and the story that he represents on the top of the mountain of, God's fiery, thunderous judgment and the rock that represents Jesus protecting him and then the still small voice, there's something about that we love. But the problem is, just like Elijah, it's impossible to understand salvation through the story of Elijah. The story of Elijah, as merciful and as gracious as that story was, it doesn't tell the story of salvation. It just tells the story of mercy. It's incomplete. It's unable to go the rest of the distance. When you look at the law, first of all, everybody wants justice when it benefits them. The problem is it's like starting a house fire before you leave the house, is that you light a fire to burn up the things that you don't want, and then before long, you're caught in that same trap because the law, unchecked, justice unchecked, all that it does, it serves to eliminate all of us. So when you look at the story of Moses at the top of the mountain and you really drill down and focus in and you eliminate all the other distractions and you look at the sanctity of the law, what you realize is the lack of qualifications that we all have. And that as beautiful as the story of Moses was, the problem is when you look too close, it just leaves all of us underqualified. What we realize is that we're incapable of salvation through the law. We're incapable of salvation fully through mercy. We're incapable of salvation fully through the law. And so when Jesus collects those two, the symbols, the representation of mercy and justice, and then he begins to transfigure into this glowing light, what it's saying is, I'm the completion of what I started in Elijah. I am the completion of what I started in Moses, and you can never look too close. You can never look too close, because the closer you look at God, the better he becomes and the more in need of him we become. I heard this week. I didn't know it. Have you ever had something scary, like you hear a cougar or something in the mountains and the hair on the back of your neck stands up? There's a word for that, and I don't know it, but there is a word for it. And that when a cat sees a dog and it puffs up, and when a chicken sees something and it gets puffy, it's all the same physical response. Biology has this response where it says it's two things. It's that we're terrified and that we're magnified. We're terrified, we want to get away from it, and we're drawn into it. And that's what we see in the disciples, is that all of a sudden it's too much. What they realize is they're looking at the completion of all the good of mercy and all the good of justice, that Jesus represented all of that, and that no matter how close you look, it just gets better and better and better. It's like looking at a picture, and as you drill down even to the fibers of the carpet in the picture, even that is worth seeing, that Jesus, there's no amount of detail in the story of Jesus that leaves us wanting. Jesus is a full embodiment of them both. So let's bring it back to where we live. I knew before I even started this was going to be a heady week. But if what makes you human is your ability to derive meaning from what you see, or you're able to derive the story out of what you see. And if, as people, one of the things that makes us conscious is the ability to take in everything but know what's important and what's not important, to see value and know to look at that and see unimportance and look away from that. And that we do that by telling ourselves a story, or by understanding the story. Understand this story. Jesus comes and he says, all that you've wondered about, all the curiosity, all of the things that were incomplete, everything that mercy and justice couldn't accomplish, all of that through me is fully realized and fully embodied in the person of Jesus. And do you remember I said John Vervecchi, one of the things he said is we don't respond to behaviors, we respond to meaning. Once we understand the meaning, our behaviors line up. That's what Jesus is teaching. It says that faith without works is dead. What's that mean? Unless you understand the meaning of what you're doing, your behaviors are always going to struggle. And so what that also means is this. Listen to what Peter said. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Peter, I hope this makes sense. I think it will. Peter was focusing on the wrong part of the story. He was looking at the story and he was misidentifying the important part, because he's kind of doing what religious people do, is that he was taking a moment that was so big and magnificent and he was applying a behavior to that, because he's saying, I'll do this for you. I'll make myself worthy for you. I'll build you something. I'll do something to make myself valuable. Watch God, I'll do this and then I'll be good. Or watch God, I'll do this. And what that means is this: the same evidence that caused James and John to just absorb it, the same evidence that Elijah and Moses are experiencing, the exact same evidence that caused them to respond in awe causes Peter to respond in religion. That means this: it is a choice. How we engage with a holy God that is fully relational, fully mercy, fully justice, the way that we engage with that God is really truly determined by the scope of our focus. If we take him at his word and decide that we're going to daily clear the whiteboard and remind ourselves of who he is, not what we're trying to accomplish. Peter is trying to bring Jesus, Elijah, and Moses into his narrative of him being the hero. I don't think he would have said it that way. I don't think he would have acknowledged it that way. But what he's saying is, I'll do this, and then I'll be the hero of this moment. When you clear the whiteboard and you go, wait a minute. What am I supposed to be seeing here? The story is Jesus brings me to the top of the mountain. He's fulfilling the mercy. He's fulfilling the justice. He's going to die on the cross. He's going to be my solution. He's going to be my port. Nobody comes to the Father except through Jesus. Oh, wait a minute. He's the narrative. And when he gives us the word, that becomes our narrative. And we begin to prioritize what's important according to his narrative for our lives instead of our narrative for our own lives. Just to take him at his words. Anybody remember that song? 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus. And one of the lines that's just to take him at his word, just to trust that the story he told through him, he's telling a story through me, and that when I will align my values and where I place my focus, when I will align my areas of focus, when I will call things unimportant and I will call other things important, if I can align that to the nature and to the story of Jesus, what I find is I become more alive. In him, remember this verse? In him we live and move and what? Have our being. Our story comes to life when we align our lives to his narrative and we focus on who he is. And when the distractions come in and get on the whiteboard, every day we're clearing it off going, I need to align today towards the ultimate good. I need to sacrifice everything towards the ultimate good. I need to give up bad and replace it with good. I need to give up what's good for now for what's good for later. And we cannot prioritize and tell the proper story until we understand or grasp the magnitude of who God is. And it's a choice. Isn't that fascinating? It's a choice. Science will tell us this, that the only way that we get to choose to focus on anything is if we first acknowledge our bias. That's it. We have to acknowledge our bias. Our bias determines what gets our focus. And so when we take on the nature of Jesus, when we take on the nature of salvation and we fully accept that we are a new being, we are a new creature, we are also accepting, sometimes through discipline, sometimes through nature, mostly, for me, mostly through discipline, that we're accepting a new narrative. We're accepting a new, ready for this, a new bias. I start to take in things through openness and love, and even if it costs me something, what's good for you, instead of the bias or the narrative of fear that says I have to take care of myself. See, this is the thing. He didn't just transfigure at the top of the mountain. He is transfiguring us. He is transcending our nature. He is giving us a new set of standards by which to categorize the world. He's reestablished a set of values that teach us how to interpret what's coming in and go, that's not important. That's not important. Wait, that matters. That's what love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. When you look at the fruits of the Spirit, he's going, these things are important. When he says, it doesn't matter what it costs you, sell everything and get wisdom. What he's saying is this part of the story is important. Focus in on it. And when he's saying, turn the other cheek and pray for those who persecute you, what he's saying is your fences are not important. Trust the story and let those things go. Choosing to get to what to focus on. And just like Peter, I think sometimes we're so determined to be the hero of the story, we take all this information and go, okay, I'll do that. Watch how I do it. Watch how well I do it. And the nature of Jesus is, show me who you are. Show me who the Father is. Show me who I am so that I can learn to prioritize in my life what matters and what needs to let go. Unforgiveness needs to let go. Bitterness, let go. Fear, let go. All these things that are just dominating the painting in our minds that are so detailed that we can't even get to the story or what's important. It's like we've surrendered our story to the things that cause us the most pain. Can I say that one more time? It's almost like we've surrendered the advancement of our story because the things that hurt us the most get the most bulk of our focus and our attention. Moses, Elijah, Jesus at the top of the mountain. It's this culmination of Jesus saying what Moses couldn't do through the law, what Elijah couldn't do through strictly mercy, I'm going to do through the blood on the cross, and that as a result, you get a new bias. You get to choose new things, new natures, and you get to live fully in the story. Let's pray. Lord, there's a verse in the Bible that talks about that through the foolishness of preaching, people are saved, and maybe that's all that today is. But God, what I'm asking is that you help us to derive meaning, that you start helping us understand that you're telling a story. There is a narrative alive and at work in our lives, God, and if we could understand it, we could better categorize or better prioritize what's important and what matters and not get so distracted and focus on things that don't matter or of no value. Put this to work in our lives, God. Help us to understand that you didn't ask us to build the huts at the top of the mountain. You asked us to acknowledge you as the ultimate good, the ultimate worth sacrificing for. the good of tomorrow that lets us sacrifice for today. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.